Today is Saturday, March 1st, 2020.
Shut up!
On July 15, 2008, Cindy Anthony called 911 from a parking lot in Orlando, Florida. She had just found her daughter Casey's abandoned car, a white Pontiac Sunfire, and the smell coming from the trunk had stopped her cold. In the recording, Cindy's voice breaks into something between panic and certainty. She told the dispatcher the car smelled like a dead body had been inside it. She said she could not find her granddaughter. She demanded police immediately. That call was the moment 31 days of silence collapsed. For over a month before that call, 2-year-old Kaylee Anthony had been missing, and for all of that time, her mother Casey had said nothing. She had not reported Kaylee to police. She had not called anyone. She had, by every available account, continued living almost exactly as she had before. Going to parties, entering a hot body competition at a nightclub, spending nights away from home. Around 10 days after Kaylee was last seen alive, Casey had a new tattoo placed on her shoulder. It read, "Bella Vita, the beautiful life." To her parents, George and Cindy, Casey explained Kaylee's absence with a story about a babysitter, a woman named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, whom the family knew as Zanny the nanny. Zanny had taken Kaylee somewhere. Kaylee was fine. There was nothing to worry about. When investigators later searched for Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, they found a real woman by that name who had never met Casey Anthony and had no connection to Kaylee whatsoever. After the 911 call, Casey was brought in for questioning. The lies continued and multiplied. She led detectives to apartments that did not exist. He described workplace routines that had no basis in reality and told investigators she was employed at Universal Studios Orlando. When detectives accompanied her to the studios to follow up, she walked them through the building and into a conference room before finally admitting she had not worked there in years. Every story she told fell apart under the most basic scrutiny. The forensic evidence developing in parallel was far harder to explain away. Inside the trunk of the Sunfire, analysts found biological material consistent with human decomposition. A single hair recovered from the trunk was identified as Kaylee's and showed post-mortem root banding, a characteristic associated with hair from a body in decomposition. Testing also detected unusually high concentrations of chloroform, a compound with no ordinary domestic explanation. The prosecution would later argue this evidence pointed toward a deliberate, planned act. On December 11, 2008, a utility worker near the Anthony family home made a discovery in a wooded area just off a residential road. A plastic bag. Inside it, a small skull. Kaylee Anthony had been found 6 months after she was last seen alive. Evidence at the scene included duct tape near the skull, a detail that would become central to the prosecution's theory of cause of death. The trial began in May 2011 and became one of the most watched criminal proceedings in American television history. The prosecution presented Casey as a young woman who had ended her daughter's life to regain her freedom. The defense, led by Jose Baez, offered a counter-narrative that Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family swimming pool, and that George Anthony had discovered the body and orchestrated a cover-up, and that Casey's behavior, the lies, the silence, the apparent indifference, was the product of years of trauma and abuse within the family home. Baez acknowledged that Casey had not told the truth. He argued that the truth she was hiding was different from the one the prosecution alleged. On July 5, 2011, after 6 weeks of testimony and 11 hours of jury deliberation, Casey Anthony was acquitted of first-degree murder, aggravated manslaughter, and aggravated child abuse. She was convicted of 4 counts of lying to law enforcement. Because she had already served the equivalent time during pretrial detention, she was released within days. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Networks broadcast crowds gathering outside the courthouse in disbelief. Commentators described the verdict as a failure of the justice system. The phrase, "America's most hated mother," appeared in outlets across the country. As of 2025, Casey Anthony lives in South Florida. She has given occasional interviews in which she maintains her innocence. The jury reached its verdict. The question of what happened to Kaylee Anthony in the last hours of her life has never been formally answered. In September 2019, 2 children vanished from Rexburg, Idaho. 16-year-old Tylee Ryan was last seen with her family on September 8, 2019, photographed at Yellowstone National Park. Ordinary vacation photos that would later be entered into evidence. Her 7-year-old half-brother J.J. Vallow, who had been adopted and had special needs, was last seen at school a few weeks later. After that, his mother, Lori Vallow, told people he was being homeschooled. No one saw him, again. When police conducted a welfare check in November 2019 and asked Lori Vallow where her children were, she gave them nothing. No explanation, no location, no expression of concern. Within days, she had left Idaho with a man named Chad Daybell. The two of them traveled to Hawaii, checked into a resort, and were photographed smiling on the beach. Neither of them contacted authorities about the missing children. When reporters later asked neighbors and acquaintances to describe Lori Vallow around that time, the word that came up repeatedly was calm. The story that investigators would eventually construct around Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell was one of the most conceptually disturbing in modern American criminal history, not because of a single violent act, but because of an entire belief system constructed to make violence feel not only permissible, but righteous. Chad Daybell was a self-published author of apocalyptic fiction who had positioned himself within certain fringe religious communities as a prophet. He claimed to receive visions about the end of the world. He taught that souls could be classified as belonging to the light or to the darkness, and that those classified as dark or zombified were no longer truly human. They were vessels for evil. And according to the theology Chad and Lori had built together, dark souls needed to be removed from the world before the final reckoning arrived. By the time the two of them became involved in 2019, the deaths had already begun. Lori's fourth husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed in July 2019 by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, in what was initially recorded as a claim of self-defense. Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy Daybell, died in her sleep in October 2019. Authorities accepted her death as natural at the time. Later investigation would determine she had been poisoned. Chad and Lori were married within 2 weeks of Tammy's death. After the welfare check failed to produce the children, investigators began building a parallel case. In June 2020, with a search warrant in hand, they excavated the grounds of Chad Daybell's property in Salem, Idaho. They found 2 burial sites. In one, J.J. Vallow's body had been wrapped in plastic and secured with tape. In the other, what remained of Tylee Ryan had been subjected to extensive destruction. The physical condition of the remains reflected investigators' most disturbing conclusions. Not a single moment of crisis, but a deliberate, planned process. Witnesses testified that Lori had spoken about her children in the terms of Daybell's belief system. She had told people that Tylee and JJ were zombified, that they were no longer the children she had known, but dark entities. The prosecution argued that this framework had not simply coexisted with what happened, but had directly enabled it, that the belief system had been constructed, consciously or otherwise, to make the elimination of the children theologically defensible. The trial of Lori Vallow Daybell began in 2023 and lasted several weeks. Text messages, photographs, and witness accounts described a world of private rituals, classified souls, and conversations about light and darkness that, in context, were unmistakably about the fate of real people. The jury convicted Lori Vallow on all counts: the murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, and conspiracy to commit the murder of Tammy Daybell. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and showed no emotion when the verdict was read. As of 2025, Lori Vallow Daybell is incarcerated in an Idaho facility. Chad Daybell awaits his own separate trial and faces the death penalty for his alleged role in all 3 deaths. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, died in December 2019 before charges could be filed against him. The children who disappeared from Yellowstone and from a school hallway in Rexburg had names, and families who searched for them, and ordinary photographs taken on ordinary days that are now the last record anyone has of them alive. Whatever theology surrounded their deaths, that fact does not change. On the evening of May 19, 1983, a small Nissan tore into the parking lot of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. The woman behind the wheel was 27-year-old Diane Downs. Her clothing was stained with blood. On the back seat, her 3 children, 8-year-old Christy, 7-year-old Cheryl Ann, and 3-year-old Danny, had all been shot. Cheryl Ann was already dead. The other 2 were fighting for their lives. Diane herself had only a shallow wound on her forearm. Still inside the emergency entrance, she began telling staff and police what she described as an attack by a bearded stranger who had stopped her on a rural road, attempted to steal her car, and then opened fire on the family. She said she had panicked and driven to the hospital to save her children. On the surface, it sounded like the kind of story that warranted immediate sympathy, but within the first hour, something began to feel wrong. The doctors noticed it. The police noticed it. Diane was not distressed. She was calm, almost eerily so. Witnesses said she smiled. She made small talk. And rather than focusing on the condition of her critically injured children, she seemed primarily concerned with reaching a man named Robert Knickerbocker by phone. Investigators quickly identified Knickerbocker as a married man with whom Diane had been involved in an obsessive, consuming relationship. He had made his position clear. He had no interest in being with a woman who came with 3 children. Diane's diary, obtained during the investigation, made the implication undeniable. Page after page was consumed by her fixation on Knickerbocker, her longing, her frustration, and her increasingly explicit belief that her children were the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted. The entries did not hide it. They stated it. From the start, the investigation was complicated by Diane's willingness to cooperate in ways that should have diffused suspicion, but instead amplified it. She agreed to participate in a filmed reenactment of the attack. On camera, she walked investigators through the scene, calmly, clearly, almost cheerfully, demonstrating how the stranger had leaned into the car window and fired. She smiled at the camera. The footage circulated widely and shocked the public. For investigators, it was the moment the case crystallized. This was not a traumatized mother. This was a performance. Diane continued changing details with each retelling. The physical evidence accumulated steadily against her, and then came the testimony that ended the case. Christy Downs had survived, but she had suffered a severe brain injury. For months, she could barely communicate. Prosecutors worked carefully, patiently, with the 8-year-old as she slowly relearned how to form words and sentences. When District Attorney Fred Hughey finally asked her, quietly and directly, whether she knew who had shot her, Christy paused and answered with 2 words: "My mama." She was precise. She described how Diane had stopped the car, picked up a gun, and fired on her own children. At trial in the summer of 1984, Diane Downs showed no sign of remorse. She entered the courtroom visibly pregnant, a calculated attempt to generate sympathy, and her demeanor throughout remained composed, occasionally flirtatious toward reporters and utterly disconnected from the gravity of what was being presented. The jury was not persuaded. In June 1984, she was convicted of murder in the first degree for the death of Cheryl Ann and 2 counts of attempted murder for the shootings of Christy and Danny. The sentence: life in prison plus 50 years. When the verdict was read, Diane's response was defiant. She stated flatly that she had not killed her children. No softening, no grief, no acknowledgement, just the same cold insistence she had maintained from the beginning. In 1987, she escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center and remained at large for 10 days before being recaptured. She has been denied parole repeatedly and remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Christy and Danny were adopted by Fred Hughey and his wife, the prosecutor who had fought for them in court, and they were given the quiet life their mother had decided they stood in the way of. Diane Downs has never changed her story. She still maintains a stranger pulled the trigger. But Christy, who learned to speak again just to tell the truth, made that version impossible a long time ago. On June 14, 2015, a Facebook post appeared on a profile shared by Claudine Blanchard and her daughter Gypsy Rose. It read, in blunt and shocking language, that someone was dead. Neighbors in Springfield, Missouri, who knew the Blanchards assumed it was a hack, some kind of dark, inexplicable prank. But when a welfare check was requested and police entered the home, they found Claudine D. Blanchard dead in her bedroom, the victim of multiple stab wounds. And Gypsy Rose, the young woman everyone in the neighborhood knew as wheelchair-bound, gravely ill, unable to walk, barely able to function, was gone. The community's first response was fear for Gypsy. She was fragile, they believed. She had leukemia. She had muscular dystrophy. She required a feeding tube and a breathing monitor. She was intellectually limited. She could not possibly have gone far alone. A search began immediately. That search would eventually lead to the most unsettling revelation the case produced. There was nothing wrong with Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She could walk. She had never had leukemia. She did not have muscular dystrophy. The feeding tube, the wheelchair, the shaved head, the years of hospitalizations and specialist appointments and fundraising campaigns, all of it had been constructed and maintained by her mother. D. Blanchard had subjected her daughter to unnecessary medical procedures, imposed false diagnoses across multiple medical teams, and controlled Gypsy's entire reality for more than 2 decades. It was, investigators and psychiatrists concluded, a textbook case of Munchausen by proxy, a condition now formally known as factitious disorder imposed on another, in which a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a dependent person in order to receive attention, sympathy, and validation. The machinery of Dee Dee's deception was extensive. She told doctors in multiple states that Gypsy suffered from a rotating list of severe conditions, and she moved frequently enough that no single medical team ever had the full picture. She leveraged the diagnoses to receive charitable donations, free travel, and public recognition as a devoted, selfless mother. The family received a home from the charity Habitat for Humanity on the basis of Gypsy's supposed medical needs. Dee Dee was celebrated. She was thanked. She was photographed at charity events with her sick child beside her in a wheelchair. Inside that wheelchair, Gypsy was fully capable of standing up and walking away, but she didn't, because Dee Dee had managed the psychological dimension of the imprisonment with equal precision. She told Gypsy that her mental development had stalled at the level of a 7-year-old. She threatened that no one would believe Gypsy if she spoke out. She monitored her communications, controlled her movement, and isolated her so completely that Gypsy grew up with no reliable reference point for what a normal life should look like. In 2012, Gypsy found one. She began communicating secretly online, using a tablet she had hidden from her mother. She connected with Nicholas Godejohn, a young man with his own serious psychological difficulties. The relationship deepened over 3 years. Gypsy, according to her later testimony, believed there was no other way out. In the early hours of June 14, 2015, she let Nicholas into the house. She waited in the bathroom. Nicholas stabbed Dee Dee Blanchard 17 times. The two then left together for Wisconsin, where they were arrested within days. The criminal proceedings split into two very different narratives. Nicholas Godejohn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Gypsy Rose entered a plea arrangement in 2016, accepting a charge of second-degree murder and a sentence of 10 years. Prosecutors and the public grappled openly with the complexity of her situation. She had participated in a killing, but she had also spent her entire life as the victim of a sustained, medically enabled form of abuse that no institution had ever recognized or stopped. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was released in December 2023. As of 2025, she is 33 years old, living publicly and speaking openly about the years of abuse and the choices she made to end them. Her case remains one of the most legally and morally contested in American true crime, a reminder that the concepts of victim and perpetrator do not always divide cleanly, and that some cages are invisible to everyone except the person locked inside. In 2013, a case in Gwinnett County, Georgia left investigators describing what they found in terms that went beyond shock into something quieter and, in some ways, harder to explain. There was no sudden violent act, no explosive confrontation. What investigators documented in the Moss family apartment was the accumulated evidence of a deliberate, sustained choice made every single day over a period of years to allow a child to disappear slowly while the household around her continued as normal. The child was 10-year-old Imani Moss. The woman responsible was Tiffany Moss, her stepmother. Imani was Eamon Moss's daughter from a prior relationship, and by the account of everyone who observed the household from the outside, neighbors, teachers, community members, the family appeared unremarkable, quiet, religious, friendly. No one had any immediate reason to believe that within those walls, two entirely different standards were being applied to the children under one roof. The children Tiffany and Eamon shared together received regular meals, attention, and care. Imani received none of those things. She was being systematically denied food, isolated from family activities, and progressively cut off from ordinary life. While other children in the apartment ate together, Imani was kept apart. Over time, she was confined more and more to a single room. At school, teachers had noticed the signs as early as 2010. Imani came in hungry. She asked classmates for food. She collected leftovers. A mandatory report was filed, and Imani was removed from the home and placed with a foster family. The accounts of that period describe a child who responded immediately to care, who became more present, more engaged, more herself. Then, Eamon Moss's custody application succeeded. Imani was returned to the household. The door closed again, and this time it stayed closed. The deprivation escalated after her return. According to the investigation, Imani was progressively denied access to food and eventually confined almost entirely to a room. She grew weaker, thinner, quieter. By October 2013, she could no longer leave the room under her own power. On October 8, 2013, she died. When investigators later obtained her weight at the time of death, the number was staggering: 31 pounds. That is the weight of an average child under the age of 4. Imani was 10 years old. What followed the death revealed the full nature of what the investigation was dealing with. Tiffany and Eamon Moss did not contact emergency services. Instead, they placed Imani's body in a trash receptacle behind the apartment building, poured accelerant over it, and set it on fire. The smoke brought neighbors outside. Neighbors brought the fire department. The fire department brought police. What investigators found inside the apartment was not a scene of sudden violence. There was no evidence of a single catastrophic event. There were locked doors, empty dishes, photographs of a child whose physical deterioration had been visible and gradual. The apartment told a story of prolonged, deliberate, daily cruelty, hiding in plain sight for years, and that every institutional safeguard had failed to stop in time. Officers who entered the scene later testified that the most disturbing element was not the fire or its aftermath. It was the order, the routine, the sense that everything in the apartment had continued functioning normally, systematically, around one room where a child was not surviving. Tiffany Moss went to trial in 2019. She chose to represent herself. Throughout the proceedings, she said almost nothing. She presented no witnesses, made no arguments, offered no defense. When prosecutors displayed evidence documenting Amani's condition, Tiffany Moss sat without expression. Jurors described watching her as deeply unsettling, not because she seemed dangerous, but because she seemed entirely unreachable. The jury convicted her of malice murder, cruelty to children, and concealing the death of another. The sentence was death. When Tiffany Moss became the only woman on Georgia's death row, Emin Moss entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He acknowledged that he had been aware of what was happening to his daughter and had done nothing to stop it. As of 2025, Tiffany Moss is incarcerated at Arundel State Prison, awaiting execution. She has refused all interviews. She has shown no remorse. The child who had flourished briefly in a foster home, who had recovered when given the most ordinary care, remains the quiet center of the case. Her name was Amani Moss. She was 10 years old. 5 women, 5 completely different circumstances. Romantic obsession, a deliberate disappearance, daily indifference, manufactured illness, and a self-invented apocalypse. Every one of these stories arrives at the same unbearable point. A child harmed by the person every culture defines as protector. What makes these cases so hard to set aside is not the violence. It is how sustained each failure was. Diane Downs wrote about her children as obstacles. Tiffany Moss locked a door every morning for years. D.D. Blanchard maintained a lie for decades. Lori Vallow assigned her own children a category that made their deaths feel justified. These were not moments of sudden darkness. They were repeated choices. The system failed in some of these cases. Warning signs existed in all of them. The question these 5 stories leave behind is not just about the women. It is about everything around them that looked away. Leave a comment with the case that stayed with you longest. Subscribe if you want to stay. And one question: of all the warning signs across these 5 cases, which one should have been impossible to miss?